these days that there's a whole vocabulary about welcoming. I've seen plenty of memes and heard a few talks parsing out the difference between acceptance or inclusion, welcoming, invitation, integration. There are several other adjacent words. And while I'm sure that these shades of differences are important, there remains an underlying question. Is the dominant group willing to be changed in the process of opening more to the marginalized group? More to the point, are we willing to open ourselves to change and growth in the process of living into our vision of beloved community? A few weeks ago, I mentioned that I had attended Booker T. Washington High School. However, that Sunday, I failed to explain anything about who Booker T. Washington was. Some of you are familiar with the name, I hope. For many, Booker T. Washington is synonymous with Black progress and opportunity. Others criticize him for accommodating racism and being too indirect in approach. The challenge with heroes is that we paint them with a very broad brush. Once we put them on a pedestal, we fail to recognize the compromises that they had to make to get there. So at the turn of the 20th century, around 1890 to 1815, Booker T. Washington was the primary leader of African American community. He was born into slavery and freed when U.S. troops reached his Virginia home during the Civil War. As a young man, he worked in agriculture, but was able to attend the newly created Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. In 1881, he became the leader of that important school and really overhauled the school's curriculum and what it was all about. One notable example of this engaging students was asking the students themselves to help build the buildings that they would learn in and live in. It was a very dynamic way of teaching. Beyond his influence in education, Booker T. Washington dominated Black politics, especially finding support in the South. And he was the first Black person to be publicly invited to the White House to meet with then-President Theodore Roosevelt. Washington's focus on building Black business and entrepreneurship made a huge difference for mobilizing folks and really raising a middle class among the community. He used his inroads that he had gained in media and in politics to heap rewards and favors on those who had helped him, his allies. It sounds pretty amazing. He created huge positive change. Not everyone agreed. While Booker T emphasized education and entrepreneurship, he refused to directly challenge Jim Crow segregation or the disenfranchisement of Black voters in the South. Black activists in the North, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois, disagreed with Washington's strategy. And he pretty much directly condemned it, what they called the Atlanta Compromise. That Atlanta Compromise was where Booker T. Washington specifically talked about vocational training over more academically rigorous higher education. And Washington suggested the Black community quiet the demands for integration and for the vote. Now, Booker T. Washington today isn't nearly as famous as W.E.B. Du Bois, but I wanted to offer this little historical window today as a reminder of how marginalized groups have always used various strategies to gain access. Those on the outside of the circle, the marginalized group, whoever they are, face hard decisions about how to make space for themselves in the midst of a dominant culture. Will they slip in without causing too much pushback? Or should they come in head held high and assert their equal right and a seat at the table? whether it's in feminism or queer liberation or access for people with disabilities, immigration, or coming to a new religious community. The outsider sometimes makes difficult decisions about how they will take up space, quietly or in more outspoken ways. While the marginalized identity or person may choose an entry that is gentle or accommodating, that is their choice. That choice is fundamentally different from a dominant group's desire or request for the outsider to fit in or assimilate or quietly go along with the established way of doing things. There's one other historical example that I would briefly mention that caught my attention a few years ago as a surprise. We know today how the Constitution was used as a tool for expanding rights for votes for both African Americans and women. But in the 1800s, most of the most outspoken abolitionists viewed the Constitution as an inherently pro-slavery document because of the 3/5 compromise. They thought the entire government was shot. It was time to throw it out and walk away. Leading abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison burned copies of the Constitution as a symbol of his view that it was irredeemable. Frederick Douglass's push for the 13th and 14th Amendment was, in some ways, a more pragmatic approach to work within the system. Yes, we know him as a firebrand, an incredible orator who helped incredible progress. But his strategy for abolition was not the most extreme. He aimed to work within the system, to work with the Constitution rather than throw it out, and to bring all of those states and their residents, both free and slave, along with them together. Again, I lift up the perspective of Frederick Douglass as a reminder that pragmatic strategy to work within the system is a valid choice for a marginalized group. Choosing a measured, gradual approach is their prerogative if they choose. That's different from a dominant group requiring assimilation. In these discussions of inclusion, there's a now very popular expression: when you have more than you need, build a longer table, not a higher wall. There are a few different versions of this saying that you can get on t-shirts and water bottles and bumper stickers and anything else that is mass-produced. I love the sentiment. When you have more than enough, build a longer table, not a higher wall. However, I wonder if the person who came up with this metaphor has actually hosted many large dinner gatherings in their home. I wonder if they have had the experience of a dinner that actually gets bigger than anyone intended. My mom and my dad are both the oldest siblings in their family. We also had the largest house among my mom's family, the inside of the family that lived in town. In fact, the dining room table in my parents' house is the same dining room table that my mom and her siblings grew up with. It's all very Norman Rockwell. So that typically meant that Thanksgiving and Christmas would be at our house. Here's the thing. As a kid, it's not a lot of fun to have your home invaded by that much extended family, especially on Christmas when you have your new stuff to play with. Hosting Thanksgiving means that you have to entertain cousins, you have to look presentable and wear decent clothes all day. You have to engage with adults in conversation, and everything is just really loud in the house. There's no escaping it. As a child, I did not like that we hosted all of these holiday meals at home. As an adult, I look back and think, you ungrateful snot. But seriously, as an adult, I've come to appreciate the rarity of those larger gatherings. In some ways, it's the necessary adjustments that make these days special. It was the making room that makes the holiday. There's much more involved than building a bigger table. At the very least, you need to shift a bit in the dining room or bring in extra chairs. For us, expansion often required an additional table in the adjacent room, and feeding that many people requires a whole buffet setup because you can't pass that many dishes. And of course, everyone has their food preferences. The most unusual one for my family was octopus. Our exchange student from Serbia, who stayed on and still lives in the U.S. today, wanted to share his family's Christmas tradition, which was octopus. Unfortunately, Misha didn't bother to get a recipe or learn how to cook it, really. He just ended up boiling it excessively to some kind of seafood-flavored rubber. Merry Christmas. I can imagine here in California, the dietary restrictions and ethical eating practices among family are even more complicated than that. And don't forget about timing. My theory is anytime a meal gets bigger than immediate family by 2 steps, it gets postponed by an hour from the original start time. Perhaps your larger families are easier. Perhaps your friend groups are better coordinated, but I doubt it. When we widen the circle, it becomes a different event, and that's okay. I've learned to accept and even enjoy that shift. In some ways, it is extra effort. The dragging in of mismatched chairs and card tables makes it special. I've been speaking here about the role of the host, but it's worth also noting what makes a good guest or newcomer. In my home, and I think around Tapestry, the ideal guest or new person is someone who gets in there and gets comfortable and dives in. Of course, being new, being in someone else's space can feel confusing, but we are all here to have a good time. Aunts, grandparents, cousins, guests, hosts, whoever you are, you've been invited into the family. Embrace that invitation as much as you can. Our Unitarian Universalist tradition has a list of core values that we revised over the past couple of years. We're still getting more acquainted with them. One of the values that's really easily skipped over is the value of transformation. You may have heard this list went through several revisions. In the first draft of the values, instead of the word transformation, the writers used the word evolution. I remember thinking, yeah, evolution. It's pretty amazing and inspiring. Nature's drive toward more diverse and abundant life, the process that gave rise to humanity, it's absolutely worth recognizing. That's worth our attention. I also thought about how strange it is that we have to recognize a scientific law as a value. I don't know if it's sad or wonderful that embracing science differentiates us from some religious neighbors. So maybe it was the nature-loving transcendentalist part of me that heard the word evolution through such a narrow scientific lens. It might also have been the part of me that avoids personal change, the part that always orders the same thing at any restaurant. and thrives with a well-maintained calendar. Regardless of why I read evolution to be just about science and not as a broad metaphor, the editors of the value statement eventually clarified that they had a broader concept in mind. It wasn't just evolution, but transformation that we value. The entire statement reads, quote, "Transformation. We adapt to a changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect." Someone spent a lot of time writing that. I like this much better than evolution. The value of transformation calls us forward in all sorts of ways, whether it's our faith communities or our own perspectives. Transformation reminds us that change isn't just inevitable, it's a value, it's a gift, it's an opportunity. We can't wall ourselves off in defiance of nature. Life is dynamic. Life is changing. One of the healthiest ways we seek change is by opening the circle of community wider and wider every day. Amen.